Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my race reaction for the Bahrain or Sakhir GP. What was your thoughts on this GP race? Did it meet your expectation for the F1 opener for the 2024 season, or was it a little bit dull in your regard? I think it was a little bit dull. Even though we had a little bit of race action on track, it wasn't as much as I was hoping for. And then, of course, the front of the field just kind of went away with the Red Bulls and not really having a fight in that regard either. So we did get to see some information about some where the back teams kind of lined up with each other, and there's kind of a little bit of surprise here and there, but not a whole lot of action on track in my viewpoint. So this made it a little bit dull race. So I ended up giving it a 3 out of 10, maybe a 4 out of 10, just because it's the opener, so the anticipation might be skewing my thought pattern there. But what was your thoughts on this race? You can list those in the comments below if you think you have a reaction that was different than mine, and I would appreciate that information. I will go through the drivers from back to the field to the front of the field and how they ended up this race, and give you my thoughts on those and how they ended up, and potentially give you some information on why they ended up where they did. So, without further ado, we'll start off with Logan Sargent in that Williams, who had actually a pretty good start, gaining 3 positions on the start of the race, but ran off the track at one point and was really having a hard time getting back on track, and then it determined that their steering wheel, that they had a new steering wheel for those Williams, was giving some issues. And that was his problem with that. And so that threw him to the very back of the field because it took him a while to get back on track and back into the pits to switch that steering wheel out. So that was mainly his issue. So it kind of became a testing session for Williams in that, or Logan Sargent in that Williams vehicle. Now we have Valtteri Bottas, who had a bad start of the race, losing 2 positions on the start, and then kind of got stuck behind Hulkenberg. And when Hulkenberg rear-ended, Stroll, he ended up hitting Hulkenberg. And so he bent and damaged his front wing, and that front wing end plate was hanging out throughout most of this race. And so that kind of hurt him to start off the race with. And then, of course, he had that bad pit stop where that front left tire was having issues, and they had to get that fixed and almost had like a 60-second pit stop in that regard. So Valtteri ended up having a horrible race and ended up turning into more of a testing phase for them as well. Now we come to the Alpines with Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon, which was having not so good of a front season for this. Alpine is kind of seemed to be heavy and underpowered for what the rest of the field is. They're really struggling in all the testing phases that we've seen, and it kind of played out here in the race. So they qualified 19th and 20th, and they did gain a couple of grounds. They did have a decent start for both of them, gaining 3 positions on the start of the race. We did have a little bit of strategy differences between the two, where Pierre Gasly had a 3-stop race. They both started off on softs, went to hards, and then Ocon stayed on hards for his second pit stop, whereas Pierre Gasly on that 3rd pit stop switched back to softs to end the race. Now, we didn't see a whole lot from them since they were at the back of the field, but we'll probably have to, hopefully they can gain some information from this race to really tweak that Alpine to gain the grounds that they need and really get what they need to develop on that car to make them competitive for that mid-pack, because they're really struggling at the back of the field at this point in time. Now we come to Nico Hulkenberg, who had a qualifying of 10th, and so that made our hopes go up for that Haas vehicle. But then he had a decent start, I guess, if you want to call that, but ended up getting into the back of Stroll, and that's pretty much all his fault in my viewpoint from looking at that replay. He just kind of didn't lock up or anything. He just kind of ended up into the back of Stroll fairly hard, and that damaged Nico Hulkenberg's front wing, where he had to come in on that first lap to actually get that replaced. So that put him on an alternate strategy from the back of the field, dropping back into that back of the field. So he ended up having a 3-stop race as well. The first one basically just to replace that front wing and then switch from the softs to the hards, and they stayed on hards until that very last pit stop from lap 41 where he switched back to softs. He did have some passing in here and there, but mainly it was him trying to get caught back up to the field. I have him passing Ocon on lap 51 for that 16th position. So then we get Alex Albon, which I was hoping that Williams would show off a little bit better than it has. I was actually expecting it to be better. It looked a lot better from my viewpoint in testing phases. I thought they would be more competitive with the RBs and maybe even a little bit higher in that field in regards to them. But for Alex Albon, he had a 2-place start gain on that first lap, and then switched that basically from that softs to hards on lap 15, and then on lap 36 he switched from hards to hards again and stayed in those to the end of the race. They did say that they were having some steering wheel issues that it kind of occurred to him as well. I don't think they were quite as devastating initially, so he was able to kind of struggle through the race with that steering wheel condition. So hopefully that was all that was hindering them in this race, and they'll have that fixed for the next race so that they can actually be more competitive. But because, again, they were kind of in the back, that we didn't get to see a whole lot from them, and they didn't have a whole lot of action in this race as far as I could tell. Then we come to the RBs of Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo. So I have that Yuki gained 1 position on the start of this race. He did box on lap 14, which was fairly early, from switching from that softs to hard tires, and then switched on lap 34 to another set of hard tires. He did pass Guan Yu Zhou on lap 29 for 10th, and Hulkenberg on lap 41 for 13th after all the pit stop strategy. I know he had to get orders to swap again from Daniel Ricciardo, so he went back down to that 14th position. And it really wasn't happy about that in the race. And I can kind of tell why, in the sense of that Daniel didn't get a chance to really fight, for that 12th position like they were hoping that he was going to be, even though Daniel was on the soft tires at that point in time. And I think that's why they made that switch. He sounded like a little bit of irritated immaturity in that regard, because they weren't even in point standing, so I understand you want to beat your teammate at all, in all costs in those regards. But when you get those team orders, you probably want to oblige without so much fighting, especially when you're not gaining for the points themselves. But decent race for both those RBs, not the greatest race for the RBs in the sense of where everybody else think they were going to be, as thought they were going to be more fighting with the Aston Martins in that regard, and instead of being a little bit farther back. So maybe they need some development work and trying to figure out where they are. They know they said that they had some changes they needed to do that didn't really get implemented in this track as well as they wanted to. So hopefully they can jump back into that more higher end mid position than they are today. Kevin Magnussen actually had a fairly good race, in my opinion, even though he was kind of hesitant to say so himself. He did gain 3 positions on the start of the race. He only had a 2 pit stop strategy, switching from softs to hards on lap 11, and then switching to another set of hards on lap 32. He did pass Guan Yu Zhou on lap 8 for 12th position, and was able to basically stay in that roughly between all the pit stop strategies and battling it out, getting those positions back and forth in that regard. It looked like that Haas had a little bit more race pace, didn't wear those tires out quite as well as they did in the past. And so in that regard, they've gone a step forward. They weren't just eating the tires up and having to make a ton of pit stops to stay in the fight of the people around them, but dropping them back because of the pit time differences. that they would get into. So there's still some hope for the Haas. And, with Nico Hulkenberg's 10th qualifying position, they may be able to get some speed out of that and that one lap pace as well. So that would help them keep those point running positions in the future. Then Guan Yu Zhou is probably one of the drivers of the day contenders, if you didn't vote for Sainz in that regard, because he came from a 17th position all the way up to that 11th, right behind the Aston Martins, and I was not expecting that stake kick F1 team, Sauber team, to be anywhere in that regard. I thought they would be near the back of the pack, right in front of Haas. Of course, Haas, I was thinking they would be at the very back because they didn't do a whole lot of development beyond just the race pace, because they were struggling with that last year. And they brought that big update for Haas, and so I was expecting them to be at the back, and I was expecting the stake F1 to be basically right in front of them. And so for them to get up close to that point range on the first race gives hope for me on that stake kick F1 team that they may be able to get some developments on that car and understanding to get them into the points more than they have been. But he did a really good job in that regard. I have him, gaining 4 positions on the start of the race, which is a really good start. And then, of course, I said he worked his way up, passing back and forth with Fernando Alonso several times as well, and Stroll at one point as well. So I think he did a really good job in that stake F1 car, making it to that point in time. Now, if you've made it this far and you've liked what you've seen so far, I would appreciate a like and a subscribe if you want to see more of this in the future. So now we'll jump to the top 10 drivers of this field. So we have Lance Stroll coming in 10th position. He did qualify in 12th position, which I think I should have had that as a green marker instead of a red, so excuse me for that, but he was doing a decent job. He just got hit in that first lap that made him drop back, where he had to go fight back into that position, so he did a fairly good job in that regard. I think he had a lot of fun fighting his way back up through that field just behind his teammate. Doing a decent run. As I said, he didn't have the greatest start because of getting hit, dropping 7 positions. He did a 2-stop race. Like most people did. He did pass Guan Yu Zhou on lap 34 for that 13th position and ended up working his way up into that 10th position. So even being hit, and it didn't look like it did a whole lot of damage, but it was a fairly good hit. So who knows how much damage was done on that Aston Martin. So they'll have to go look at that and figure out. But he did a fairly good job of coming back through the field and getting into that point position, that final point position. And then, of course, right ahead of him was Fernando Alonso, who qualified 6th and ended up in 9th. So not as good as he qualified in, but a good steady race for him. He did have a 2 pit stop strategy like his teammate, and then he did pass Guan Yu Zhou on lap 17 for 9th. He passed Guan Yu Zhou again on lap 45 for 10th, and he passed his teammate Stroll on lap 49 for that 9th position. So he was basically maintaining his tires or the fuel in his vehicle, from what I could tell. So he was having to rein that Aston Martin in a little bit, for the long haul. So hopefully they'll have a little bit more guidance on that. Maybe they were hoping for more of a caution that would help them through this field at the end of the race, getting a lighter load. But he did have to conserve and kind of lift and coast for a lot of this race. So he was kind of stuck in that position. Hopefully the Aston Martins have a better idea what they need to do for the upcoming races. But in general, not a bad running, not a great running for the Aston Martins. They kind of end up where I was thinking they were going to end up, behind the McLarens and the Mercedes in that regard. So I think they're roughly where I was expecting them to be. It's just a matter of how competitive they are going to be for that 8th and 7th positions in the future. Then we get to Oscar Piastri, who qualified 8th and ended up in 8th. He had a decent race, just kind of going through the field. He did pass Alonso on lap 5 for that 7th position, and then passed Alonso again on lap 40 for the 8th position. Kind of staying in that regard, staying in there, still learning a lot, not quite where his teammate is on regards to everything. I know they were struggling on that last corner, which they were basically saying that they're going really, really slow, so that they, even though they had technically the lap pace, they weren't able to hook it up in that last corner for that long straightaway to really gain the DRS action that they needed to really slipstream and make the passes they need to get around the people that were semi-close in speeds around them. And I think that was what their main concern is, so hopefully they can figure out if that was just a setting that they had miscalculated on for this race, or if that was something that needs to be looked at in depth a little bit more. So that kind of gives you an idea of where the McLarens are, even though they were split by Lewis in that 7th position. Lewis was qualified in 9th and moved up to 7. I have him actually doing even on the start, not gaining any positions and not losing any positions. He did pass Alonso on lap 10 for 8th position. He, again, only had a 2-stop race. I know he was kind of struggling more in that Mercedes than George seemed to be in that setup. He had tried to switch the configuration in qualifying to be more race pace, but that didn't seem to pan out for him in regards. So hopefully he can figure out that Mercedes a little bit better than he has in this Bahrain GP, and get those settings really dialed in for the next race and have a better feeling for him. He also had a seat issue, or he claimed his seat broke. I didn't hear a lot more about that, so I'm not sure how his seat broke or what kind of issues that was going to give him during this race. I know it'd be kind of uncomfortable, kind of unsettling if you're having to slide around a little bit more than you're used to, or if you're getting if it's a crack or something that's, binding up something, pinching, or doing something kind of odd. So that is something else to consider for Lewis Hamilton in his run, and why he didn't quite make it to Lando. But Lando qualified in 7th and made it up to 6th. He, again, didn't have a whole lot of he had a decent start, not gaining any position, but not losing any positions either. He had a 2-stop race. He passed Alonso on lap 3 for 6th and passed Alonso again on lap 38 for 6th. So he kind of was working back and forth, trying to get those pit strategies together. I know they were trying to undercut or prevent some cuts doing these pit stops, so that kind of played into how their pit stop strategy ended up, not quite gaining the ground that he was hoping for on George. At one point, I know he was faster than George, but then he couldn't get to the point on the track where he could pass George or really put a effort in doing that because of that last corner. And I know he's really complaining about that corner. And even afterwards in the interviews, he was talking to Oscar, and they were complaining that on that corner, he said that he could probably take any existing other car and make it around faster than that McLaren could on that last corner. So that kind of tells you where he stood on that last corner and what he thought of the setup for that McLaren on that last corner. He said the rest of it was decent, but not quite as smooth as they would like. And so they have a little bit of work to do still, but that's a lot better position for the McLarens than they were last year, being in the back of the field. So they actually both got points. So that's good for the McLaren. They just need to continue that throughout the season, and hopefully they can develop that McLaren in that regard. And then you have George. George Russell actually did a fairly good race, I think, even though he ended up having to do some lifting and coasting because I think they had a power unit issue that he was having to manage throughout this race. He did gain on Leclerc on lap 3 for that second position, and kind of ended up in that second position for the first third, maybe it was just a quarter in that second position before Sergio Perez came through the field in that second position. He wasn't really gaining ground on Max like we'd hoped to, but he did fight for that second position, was able to keep that second position for a while. And so that's good, even though he was having a power unit issue as far as what the knowledge that I was gained, which then led him back and where he couldn't fight as well as he would like and dropping back into that fifth position overall. We have Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Charles Leclerc, qualified second, ended up fourth. He hated this car. I'm not sure what actual issue he had, with the setup, or if it was something that actually broke or did something, because they were saying that there was a big temperature differential between the left and the right, like on the fronts and stuff, so that he was having a really struggling time figuring out where to brake without losing too much speed and too much positions in that regard. So there was some kind of brake temperature issues that they really need to work on that Ferrari, and it seemed to be limited to Charles Leclerc's vehicle, because Carlos Sainz seemed to be pretty fast in that regard. So hopefully it was just an issue with his car and not an overarching issue with that Ferrari, that they're going to have to make any kind of major changes to make them competitive. But he was in that second position, ended up losing that position to George on lap 40 for that fourth position. And basically it was early on when he ended up losing that position, and just had to basically fall back to that fourth position overall, gaining ground again on George on lap 46 for that fourth position. But I know he was in that second position and was having to fight everything he had to keep that as long as he could, and was not able to do that because of locking that front right tire up in those corners, which then, of course, made him lose the momentum out of the corners that gave the people behind him the speed that they needed to get around him on those straightaways. Now, Carlos Sainz had a not so great a start. He lost the position on the start of the race, but was able to come back fairly strongly throughout this race. And at one point, he looked like he was kind of a rocket ship heading towards that, and was hoping that the hard tires were going to outlast the soft tires of Perez at the end of the race, so that he could gain ground and fight for that second position. But that never did happen. I know he was expecting that and was asking his engineers when that was going to happen, when the hards are going to turn to be faster than the softs. And the engineers thought that was, at that point in time, was going to occur, but it didn't look like it ever occurred. And so it looks like that Red Bull has a better feel for the soft tires than the Ferraris, at least in this Bahrain GP circuit, or Sakhir circuit. So in that regard, it's kind of troublesome with the Ferraris, but they did have a good start, and looks like they're doing a better job kind of now than they did last year's start. So hopefully they can, help with that and kind of improve upon them and gain the grounds and get those tweaks that they need on that Ferrari. He had to pass his teammate several times on different fields, and he was kind of having to send it into those corners to be really good. And so hopefully that also doesn't cause an issue of, really pushing your teammate too hard and end up colliding in that regard. But he did some good passes. He ended up being the driver of the day, and that's why that's the DOD there. And it was a good points for both Carlos and Charles, so that's good as well for the Ferrari in the fight. Of course, then we come to the last first two on the grid, Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. Sergio didn't quite qualify as well as he would have liked, coming back into that fifth position, but was able to work his way through the field, passing Leclerc on lap 7, and then passing Russell on lap 14th. That was provisionally that second position after the first pit stops. It was in 6th on track, but basically that second position after everyone pits. And so that's what kind of lost Russell his second position. He was after that fact, and then we basically gained that ground and just was able to maintain that, even though he was quite far behind his teammate at that point in time and was not able to really put any kind of pressure on Max himself. But it was a good run for Red Bull to get that 1-2. And of course, we have the winner, Max Verstappen, who had a good start of the race, maintained the lead, was able to make his way throughout this field on first place, had a 2-pit stop strategy, going from lap 17 from softs to hards, and then lap 37 from hards to softs. So he just ended up cruising throughout this race. In fact, I have him at lap 10, 7 seconds ahead of George. Then it was, 10.8 seconds ahead of Perez at lap 25. And at lap 40 was 18.5 seconds ahead of his teammate. And he ended up the race 22.4 seconds ahead of his teammate in second position. So he kind of just cruised to the win, which doesn't give us a whole lot of hope for any kind of competitiveness for that first position in the season. But I know a lot of teams say that this race was not the racetrack that they were very good at. So hopefully that'll shrink and maybe there'll be some other issues. And I know Max was kind of surprised at how easy it was. He was expecting a little bit more issues at this race. So hopefully things will just get a little bit more competitive for the viewer standpoint. But for Max's standpoint, it was a nice, easy run for him to the finish, and he had the fastest lap as well. So that made it all the more, exciting for him in that regard. So he got the pole position, the fastest lap, and the race win. So a nice triple crown for him on this Bahrain GP. Now we come to the the driver standings. And so basically this is the way they ended up in the field. So there's not a whole lot going on here. So you have Max Verstappen with 26 points, followed by Sergio Perez with 18, Carlos Sainz with 15, Charles Leclerc with 12, George Russell with 10, Lando Norris with 8, Lewis Hamilton with 6, Oscar Piastri with 4, Fernando Alonso with 2, and Lance Stroll ending up the points with that 1 point. And then the rest is basically how they ended the field, even though they have 0 points. So that gives you Logan Sargent in that 20th position as he came in last. But this is just the first race, so we'll have a lot more movement in the races to come and seeing how they end up in this driver's standings. And of course, the constructor standing is roughly how the drivers ended up, with Alpine in that 10th position with 0 points. Just ahead of them is the Williams in 9th and RB in 8th, which I was expecting to be a little bit higher in the field. Haas in 7th, which I thought was me farther back in the field. And Stake Kick Sauber Ferrari, which I thought would be farther back in the field as well, in 6th because of One You Show running. And then you have the Aston Martins with 3 points, McLaren with 12, Mercedes with 16, Ferrari with 27, and Red Bull with 44. So that's the lineup for the constructor standings. And what is coming up is the Saudi Arabia or Jeddah GP race on March 9th, which is actually on a Saturday as well. So be forewarned on that regard. The length is 3.836 miles. So there'll be 50 laps that are run for this GP, for a total race distance of 191.662 miles. The lap record is held by Lewis Hamilton from 2021 with 1 minute 30.734 seconds. And this GP race was introduced in 2021. So that gives you the idea of how long this race has been around and how Lewis has gained that lap record. And so that hopefully will give us a better feel for how everybody shakes out in the order. And hopefully we have a little bit more competitiveness up into that first and second positions. And it's not just a full Red Bull run for the season as well. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.